Hello students, welcome back to my class. Today we are going to study Anthony Trollope's autobiography, chapter 12. The title of this chapter is Novel and the Art of Writing Then. The other day we had gone through chapter 6 where we had found Trollope's evolution as a professional novelist. So, here in this chapter 12, he is desiring his uh, uh, intention to write a history of English prose fiction. And for the purpose, he has taken a period of 300 years or 3 centuries from Philip Sidney's Arcadia to Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe. And he is telling that for this purpose he had done an extensive study, and also he had found Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe as one of the worthy candidate for the study of English fiction. As we know that most of the historians has put Robinson Crusoe as the first proper English fiction in English literature. And at the same time, he is talking about the purpose, that why he will be undertaking such a grueling and extensive project like writing the history of English prose fiction. And he is giving it mostly two reasons. The first reason he is talking about is, I intended to write that book to vindicate my own profession as a novelist, and also to vindicate that public taste in literature which has created and nourished the profession which I follow. So, the very first intention of his to be a writer of history about English prose fiction is that he wanted to justify his own position as a novelist. And at the same time also he wants to put the public taste in English fiction, because in his contemporary period, in spite of the prevalence of prose fiction writing, people had some hesitant attitude towards the fiction reading. And he is telling that there was a common prejudice in respect to novels which might perhaps be lessened by producing such a work. And then, secondly, he is telling that no man can work long at any trade without being brought to consider much whether that which he is daily doing tends to evil or to good. So, the second purpose of his writing the history of English prose fiction is to bring out that how far this English prose fiction is either doing any good or it is bringing some evil into the society. And being motivated by these two reasons, he wanted to write that history, and at the same time he is also trying to bring into his writing the justification of writing English novels or novels in general, because he wants to prove that the prose fiction writers are also people of genius, ingenuity, and perseverance. And their excellences should be appreciated, and the understanding about prose fiction should be rectified out of the public bias. Then he is making a comparison between poetry and prose, and he is telling that poetry is being characterized by the nobility of expression and divine grace of words. He is telling that poetry takes the highest place in literature. Poetry in all times occupies the supreme position within the literary genres. And he is telling it is because of these two things. One, the nobility of expression, and another is the divine grace of words. Therefore, he is telling that the prose also should make an effort to attempt these two qualities of poetry. And he is telling that prose writing also should consider the binaries of virtue and vices, or good and evil, to be presented simultaneously and to be treated in an objective manner, as poetry deals with all these binaries, all these complexities, but at the same time highlights the moral purpose or the objectivity behind them. So, the prose fiction should undertake this job. And he is making a general survey of the English history from the period of Renaissance to the 19th century, and he is telling that even in 19th century, in his contemporary period, there is a general apprehension about prose fiction, and prose fiction is considered to be profane. So, people are finding it difficult to exhibit their novel reading in the public. So, people are still hiding their novels, and Peregrine Pickle was hidden beneath the bolster and Lord Ainsworth put away under the sofa. So, he is giving the example that how people were reading them, but at the same time they were being hidden from the public gaze because there was some prejudices against the prose fiction being immoral. And he is telling that by writing the history of prose fiction, he wants to do away with this type of prejudice. And next, he is telling that the purpose of the novel is to teach social behavior, that it should appeal especially to imagination and solicit the sympathy of the young. A vast proportion of the teaching of the day, greater probably than many of us have acknowledged to ourselves, comes from these books. He is telling, in spite of the discrimination against the novels, but most of these novels, they are setting the tone of the moral standard in the youth. The youth are imitating the morality, youth are imitating the experience from these novels into their own lives. And he is also talking about that the novel writer has also the capability to handle such type of delicate questions of moral balance in his writing. It becomes to him a matter of deep conscience how he shall handle those characters. And he is telling that the novel writing, because it is more expansive, so it not only deals with the binary of vice and virtue, but also deals with the innocence and the danger lurking around the pristine nature or innocence. So, the region of the vice and foul are odious. It is in these borderlands that the danger lies. The novelist may not be dull. If he commits that fault, he can do neither harm nor good. He must please. And now he is coming to the two main objectives of novel writing. Why a novel should be written, what is the duty or most sacred objective of the novelist. The most sacred objective of the novelist, like any literature or artist, is to please and instruct. So he is telling the duty of the novelist is to please. He must please, and the flowers and the grass in these neutral territories sometimes seem to give him so easy an opportunity of pleasing. So, dealing with the uncertainties of innocence and pristinity, the novelist should explore these neutral territories to please the audience. The writer of stories must please, or he will be nothing, and he must teach whether he wish to teach or no. And along with the pleasure, the novel, like any other branch of art or literature, must also instruct. And he is telling the novelist, if he have a conscience, must preach his sermons with the same purpose as the clergyman, and must have his own system of ethics. He must develop his own ethics. And he is telling that how these ethics can be developed. He is telling that in the absence of self personality, the novelist as a writer must be absent from the novel. It is the objectivity of writing, and with that absence of self personality, he should deal with the moral issues. And what is the morality? That every youth shall say, let me not have such a one as that to press my bosom anything rather than that. Then will the novelist have preached his sermon as perhaps no clergyman can preach it. So, three things: pleasure, morality, and or instruction, and objectivity. These are the three main objectives of a novelist. It should be the objective of the novelist. And then he is coming to deal with the characteristics of the novel, what the novel should do. He is telling that the novel should deal with the stories of love or amorousness. He is telling that in one respect, the necessity of dealing with love is advantageous from the very circumstance which has made love necessary to all novelists. It is necessary because the passion is one which interests or has interested all. Everyone feels it, has felt it, or expects to feel it. That love should be the inalienable element in novel writing in any form, because it is the most universal emotion, the most universal feeling, the most universal passion. Everyone feels it, so everyone can identify himself or herself with the novel. And the next characteristics, he is telling that in spite of this element of love, which is universal nature of love, makes it more acceptable. And he is telling that there are basically two types of novels. One is the sensational novels and another is the anti-sensational. He is telling that the sensational novelist and anti-sensational, sensational readers and anti-sensational, the novelists who are considered to be anti-sensational are generally called realistic. He is telling the anti-sensationalist novelists are realistic, and he finds himself as one of the realistic novelists of his period. The readers who prefer one are supposed to take delight in the elucidation of the character. Those who hold by the other are charmed by the continuation and gradual development of the plot. All this is, I think, a mistake, which mistake arises from inability of the imperfect artist to be at the same time realistic and sensational. So he is telling a novelist cannot be realistic and sensational at the same time. A good novel should be both, and both in the highest degree. If they will be, then it should be in the highest degree. If a novel fall in either, there is a failure in art. So there should be sensation and there should be reality blended in the highest order, and that is the best novel according to him. And he brings out novels like Jane Eyre as the example. And he is then talking about horror and tragedy. He is telling that some of the novelists, they subscribe to the theory of horror and they put horror in an endless manner. Horror is being created one after another without a proper objectivity. And he is calling these type of novels are mere horror novels which are unable to evoke very strong passion or emotion in the reader. But on the other hand, the tragic elements, they bring out the nobility of expression. And he is telling there is nothing so easy as the creation and the accumulation of fearful incidents after this fashion. So, cumulative effect of the horror will at last come to be simply fashionable, but without creating a permanent impression. But on the other hand, tragedy or tragic element like poetry can deal adequately with tragic elements, is a greater artist and reaches a higher aim than the writer whose efforts never carry him above the mild works of everyday life. The tragic element will make the writer deal adequately with the serious issues of life and can show to the reader life beneath the surface of reality. Then he is talking about the element of empathy. He is telling that every novel should be able to evoke the empathy in its reader. No novel is anything for the purpose either of comedy or tragedy unless the reader can sympathize with the characters whose names he finds upon the pages. So, unless we find any sympathy for the characters on the pages, then the novel fails in its objective. And next he is talking about the truth. Truth let there be, truth of description, truth of character, human truth as to men and women. And then what is the ultimate objective of the novel? The novel, like poetry, should represent the truth. Through the characters, through the narrative, through all these portrayal of various emotions and passion, it should reach at the truth. So, he is telling truth of description, truth of character and human truth. This should be there in a good novel. And in the next, he is suggesting that a novelist must be a good storyteller, and he is making a difference between telling a story and a story to tell. He is telling that I have from the first felt sure that the writer, when he sits down to commence his novel, should to do so not because he has to tell a story, but because he has a story to tell. Mark it for explanation. Explanations can be asked about that. So what he is telling, the difference between telling a story and a story to tell? He is telling that a person can go on writing stories without coming to any evocative stage of reaching at the truth. And a successful writer may write another book, another book, another book, but without being engrossed with them. And the second one, a story to tell, means a writer who is very much a part of the story, who grows with the story. So, in this way, he is bringing about the organic theory of literature and art. He is telling that a story or a plot should be organic, where the writer must grow along with the plot, along with the story, along with the characters. And when at the end of the story, the writer doesn't merely finish the story by putting a grand full stop, but makes the reader to think, to imagine further. So that is the difference, a mere telling of the story and a story to tell. And he is telling, for achieving this, the writer should avoid certain things. What are they? The repetition of the similar types of stories, and mechanical presentation, both in the narrative as well as in the characters. So, mechanical characters should be avoided, mechanical plot structure should be avoided, and there should be sensibility being exhibited by the writer through which the reader can communicate. So, he is telling that unconsciously, for the most part, been drawing in matter from all that he has seen and heard. How the writer should write or has the story to tell, is telling the writer must be unconscious for most part in his writing, been drawing in matter from all that he has seen and heard. So, from his living experiences, he must be drawing, but when he is writing, for the most part, he is immersed within the writing. He must be unconscious. And he is telling a writer can provide so many characters, but these characters should not be mechanical characters. And he is telling that a writer can provide a great variety of characters, but some of the writers, they do not do that because of their stiff mechanism. So, he is telling that it is not that any novelist, any writer is incapable of creating good characters or good narratives, good plots. Rather, it is coming from their idleness rather than from innate incapacity. So, everyone is capable, but it is due to the idleness. The writer doesn't get himself engrossed in the process of the story unfolding or in the evolution of the character. So, in this organic theory of his novel, he is telling that the plot should be organic in spite of many subplots. All the subplots, they should move towards the main plot. They must be properly connected with the main plot. They must be subscribing towards the development of the main plot. Otherwise, the story will fall apart. And secondly, he is telling the living characters or the round characters instead of the flat characters. He is telling that the characters must be taken from the real life. as we have discussed earlier in his chapter 6, that he had taken most of the characters from his acquaintances. So he is telling every writer also must bring the characters from his acquaintances with whom he must have some intimacy. He is telling, unless he knows those fictitious personages himself, and he can never know them unless he can live with them in the full reality of established intimacy. So he must have lived with such type of characters. He must have experience of these characters so that he can portray them in his novel. And they will be very lively, they will be believable, and they will be identifiable by the reader. And then he is telling that a writer must live with these characters in his memory, in his consciousness for a long time, for a longer time, to develop the characters into the fictitious characters. It is not that you merely imitate it from the real life. The writer must live with them in his consciousness to develop those characters. I have lived with my characters, and thence has come whatever success I have obtained. As he is telling, that imagination comes from familiarity. Imagination cannot come from the void. It will come from the familiarity. But for that, the writer also must have a natural propensity of instinct. Without instinct, nobody can imagine, in spite of having the familiarity with the reality or anything. Then the next important point about the characteristic of novel he is talking about is diction. He is telling that diction is one of the most important aspect of a novel, because the main purpose of the novel is to please, like any other art and literature. Therefore, it must have pleasant words. If he be confused, tedious, harsh, or unharmonious, readers will certainly reject him. So, readers won't accept confused, tedious, harsh, or unharmonious diction. The diction must be pleasant, and he may indeed be pleasant without being correct, as I think can be proved by the works of more than one distinguished novelist. But he must be intelligible. He is telling the grammatical correction or any other correction is not very much necessary. The most important thing in the pleasant diction or creating the diction to be pleasant is to be intelligible. He must be intelligible without trouble, and he must be harmonious. The diction must bring out the harmonious thought, the complex emotion and thought that is going through the writer must be expressed through such type of diction which will be pleasant to the reader. Therefore, intelligible without trouble, and he must be harmonious, which can be immediately felt or imagined on the part of the reader. And he is talking about the clarity, that the diction also must have the clarity or pellucid. They should be pellucid. They should have the clarity. And another feature of the diction must be that it should be communicative. The language used should be as ready and as efficient a conductor of the mind of the writer to the mind of the reader as is the electric spark which passes from one battery to another. So, he has given one analogy by bringing the two batteries and the spark from one battery, how it transmits to another battery. So, when the language will be very efficient and ready or pleasant, it will immediately be communicable to the mind of the reader, and that the novelist must appropriate. And he is suggesting that the writer in the matter of the diction must avoid what? Difficulties of language, to tell himself that someone little doubtful passage, some single collocation of words which is not quite what it ought to be. So the writer should avoid difficulty in expression of the language or difficult language or collocative language or any complex language, because the language must be very lucid and clear, and he should avoid any doubtful passage. The habit of writing clearly soon comes to the writer who is a severe critic to himself, and he is telling, for this there is no other formula but to practice. The writer has to write and write and write and make his writing perfect, and he must be a severe critic of himself. He must critically look at his own writing. He must put himself in the shoes of a reader. Then only he can improve his writing. Then the next important characteristic of the good novel he is talking about is style. He is telling, then what will be the style of writing of the novel? He is telling that a style may be rough and yet both forcible and intelligible, but it will seldom come to pass that a novel written in a rough style will be popular. He is telling, any novel written in rough style cannot be popular. It should be intelligible, and it should be pleasant, and it should be lucid. The harmony which is required must come from the practice of the ear. And to develop this style, the pleasant style, the writer must practice the sound of every word, the sound of the sentence, the sound of the paragraph, as a musician practices with the coordination between his mouth and ear. So the writer also must make a practice of his ear, and he should be able to weigh the rhythm of every word as it falls from his pen. So whatever he writes, immediately he should look at the rhythm, whether this particular word, particular structure of the sentence, it goes with the rhythm of the already written part of the narrative. The art of the orator is the same. So he is making a comparison between orator and the writer, as the orator always takes care of his own words, own language. So the writer must be conscious of that. And then he is coming to the size of the novel. So he is telling that the novel should neither be very short nor be very long to be divided into episodes. Episodic novels should be discarded. And similarly, very short novels should be discarded, because a novel must allow the free play of complex emotions, relations, characters, so on and so forth. So it must have an appropriate length. And he is telling why it should not be episodic. There should be no episodes in a novel. Every sentence, every word, though all these pages should tend to the telling of the story. Because if it will be episodic, then there will be the loss of unanimity or central objectivity. Because the singularity of the novel, or if it is there in one volume, it will provide the reader with the concentrated objective enjoyment. He can enjoy it in a continuous, concentrated manner. But episodic novels will not be able to sustain that intensity. Every sentence and every word used should tend to the telling of the story. And he is making a comparison between the painter and the writer of the novel. He is telling, as a painter always shoots his painting within the canvas. So, the writer of the novel also should accommodate all his characters, all his incidents, everything within a proper size. Therefore, every part of the novel, whether they are the characters, incidents, or the narrations, they must be proportionate. And when they will have the proper proportion and they will have the proper unity of the plot, then the novel will be a good one. Then he is coming to the next important characteristic of the novel, that is the dialogue. He is telling that the dialogue, it is so easy to make any two persons talk on any casual subject with which the writer presumes himself to be conversant. Literature, philosophy, politics, or sport may thus be handled in a loosely discursive style, and the writer, while indulging himself and filling his pages, is apt to think that he is pleasing his reader. So, he is telling literature, philosophy, politics, sport, they can handle the loosely discursive style. Why? Because the main purpose is to please the reader or the audience. The dialogue is generally the most agreeable part of the novel, according to Anthony Trollope. And it is only so long as it tends in some way to the telling of the main story. Therefore, he is telling that long conversations should be avoided. Dialogue should not be continued in a very longish manner, because that will play heavily on the mind of the reader. And then he is telling that the writer should be careful about the length of the dialogue. Similarly, the writer also should be careful about the appropriateness of the language of the dialogue with the character. If it is a common character, for him, the language can be talk of ordinary people is carried on in short, sharp, expressive sentences, which very frequently are never completed. And the accurate language with pedantry, air of pedantry, and slovenly inaccuracy of ordinary talkers, they cannot be complemented. So, you can't put pedantic language in the mouth of the common character. As we know that Shakespeare, the great dramatist, he is a master of this language, appropriating with the character. So, here also Anthony Trollope is suggesting that according to the character, the status of the character, the language should be appropriated, the dialogue should be appropriated. No character should utter much above a dozen words at a breath, unless the writer can justify to himself a longer flood of speech by the speciality of the occasion. So, without special occasion, a character should not be given more than a dozen words at a breath. That is the recommendation of Anthony Trollope. And then finally, he is coming to the writer of the novel. He is telling that how the novelist will know that he is writing a good novel and who is a good novelist. So, along with all these characteristics, he is telling the novelist must have the human nature as the novel writer's guide. So, the novelist must follow the human nature, which will guide him to be the writer, because the novel deals with humanity, human nature. So, unless we get the human nature being studied thoroughly or being realizing the proper spirit of the human nature, we cannot be good writers of novel. And human nature, he must remember that he does so with a pen in his hand, and that the reader who will appreciate human nature will also demand artistic ability and literary aptitude. So, only studying the human nature will not do. Along with that, the novelist also must cultivate the artistic ability, how to present that human nature in an artistic manner and with literary aptitude. There should be the literary aptitude. So these three should be blended to make him a good novelist. And then he is giving again another caution that, and then let him be aware of the creating tedium, that he should not write in such a manner which will create a sense of tedium. The fault may occur in chapters, in passages, in pages, in paragraphs. I know no guard against this so likely to be effective as the feeling of the writer himself. And who will decide that when it becomes tedious? The writer himself has to decide. So in this way, Anthony Trollope is talking about the art of writing novels. What are the different characteristics of the novels and how a writer should write a good novel. So here, besides the explanations that I have told you in between, we can expect the question. The question will deal with that what are the different objectives and characteristics of novel writing presented by Anthony Trollope in chapter 12 of his autobiography. So you can write them pointwise as I have discussed, and your answer will be there. And the explanations you can explain, and you can also provide with that various examples. He has given so many examples within his text. You can read it, or you can also bring examples from your own readings, and that will fetch you good marks. Hope you will be able to do justice to these questions.